The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
In just the 2 months that Kevin Mullin has been in the California Assembly, the state's budget has gone from deficit to surplus, and a majority of Californians now think the state is headed in the right direction. Maybe he should quit while he's ahead. The game is politics, and the game is on. South San Francisco Mayor and City Council member Kevin Mullin in 2012 was elected easily to the California State Assembly, representing most of San Mateo County in the seat held by his father. He was sworn into office in December and was named Assistant Speaker Pro Tem, a leadership position in the Assembly. He achieved all this despite his past association with me as co-host of this program. Kevin, welcome back to the game on the other side of the table.
It is great to be back. It feels like home here at Penn TV, so thank you very much for the invitation and coming back in something of a different capacity here, but looking forward to
So how's the freshman year going? Tell us what surprises you, what the pace, I would imagine, has probably come as a bit of a surprise.
The pace is very intense. First of all, it's a great honor to be representing Assembly District 22 in the State Assembly. District 22 is a slightly different configuration than the Assembly District when my father represented the area from 2002 to 2008. Then it was Assembly District 19. Now we've had a number change. We've gone through a redistricting process. The district runs from Brisbane and South San Francisco in the north to Redwood City in the south. The only legislative district that doesn't straddle a county line, my district, is wholly contained within San Mateo County, which is important for me in my hopes to be sort of a go-to legislator for the county of San Mateo, the cities in our county. But it's a tremendous opportunity. There's a great deal of optimism right now in Sacramento coming out of the recession. We had Proposition 30 pass on the ballot in November. That was the governor's sales and income tax initiative, surprisingly passed by double digits. I thought it might eke it out, but it was a really healthy victory for that measure. So we have a balanced budget environment, and there are actually projections of a surplus, which is something that was hard to imagine just 2 or 3 years ago. So there is optimism. We talked about the public approval ratings for the governor. He's in majority territory, 51%. The legislature is at 41%, which the rookies are quick to take credit for. Of course, the reality is we had nothing to do with it.
Well, that may be why it's high.
Indeed. I joke with my father that when he was there, it was at 9% public approval rating. So we have a little inter-family fun with that number. But I think it's indicative of some of the tough decisions that the previous classes have made. I mean, you know, really, truly difficult, painful cuts to social services. So there's actually an interesting split, and I know I'm kind of just taking this and running with it, but there's a really interesting split happening in a way in our caucus, just the Democratic caucus on the Assembly side, with some of the members who've been there a while, the veteran members who have done nothing but cut, who now see a little bit of revenue in the stream and a projection of a surplus, who really want to spend. They want to restore programs that have been cut.
It's part of the difficulty of having such a large Democratic majority is the Democratic Party is not monolithic.
Right.
And I can imagine, I mean, people don't go up there to undo things. They go up there to build things.
Sure.
And this must be frustrating for some of them to have gone so long without.
For those termed out members, you know, who are looking at sort of the end of their political career in Sacramento, they really want to seize this moment, restore programs. Those of us who are new to the system, who frankly haven't had to deal with that, but are looking at maybe a longer time horizon, you know, voters willing, because of the term limits modification. We want to take more of a generational kind of a view. I think just a little more fiscally responsible, if you will, in terms of putting money into a rainy day fund and just being cautious with this newfound revenue. It's not as though the voters gave us a blank check. You know, they are going to be watching how we spend their money. So there's an interesting divide, just I guess generationally is the word, between some of the veterans and the rookies. Let's
talk about the budget a little bit, because that's where a lot of these policies play out. What do you anticipate? Obviously, the budget will be in balance. It'll, you know, quite possibly be in surplus. But where do you think the money's going to go? What programs, what issues do you think are going to be addressed that haven't been? I know a lot of people are upset and want more money spent, probably more than anywhere else, on schools. Is a good place.
Sure, and one of the main reasons that Proposition 30 passed handily was the promise of more money to schools. I mean, if you look at all the public opinion polls, almost universally, school funding ranks very high. There's a real awareness of that. California is still, you know, anywhere between 47th and 49th, depending on who does the study in terms of per pupil spending. So the governor has a local control funding formula that's tied directly into the budget. I think he wants to do something big on education as an outgrowth of the passage of Prop 30 to equalize funding among school districts in California, to try to level that field, if you will, between the lower wealth school districts, base revenue limit districts, and some of the wealthier districts, like basic aid districts, and we have some of those here in San Mateo County. So I think he is looking at directing some of those new revenues, additional revenues, via this funding formula change to lower wealth districts. And you know, just the other day, I received the breakdown of which districts benefit and which districts are held steady. The districts don't backslide. They're held steady, the basic aid districts, but there's some question over time, once you create a formula and change that formula, there will be a net effect over time, and you don't want those basic aid districts to be hurting over time.
Well, yeah, the premise under which he was talking about this essentially is if you give $1,000 to one district and $1,000 to another, if the other district needs more than $1,000, that's really not truly an equal apportionment of funds. You're giving somebody's is behind, they're going to stay behind if all the funding is equal. And yet, every district has needs. Even the wealthiest districts, I'm sure, are prepared to tell you that holding steady is the same as falling behind.
Certainly, and I have meetings already set up with representatives from the San Mateo Union High School District as well as the Sequoia District, which are two of the basic aid districts who have real concerns. However, there are of the 16 both districts and charter schools on this grid. There were 16 entities that were evaluated. 12 of the 16 receive more funds, and in some cases considerably more. So I'm still trying to sort of process all of that, but I know that this is very controversial, just right out of the gate. A couple of folks in our caucus who are credible education folks, the chairwoman of the Assembly Education Committee, Joan Buchanan, has some concerns about this. She hails from a suburban area. So you may see a little bit of an urban versus suburban kind of a split. So, you know, this is, whenever you're talking about changing a funding formula, you have the potential to create winners and losers. And that's, you know, the status quo, and I've seen this already in just a couple of months here on the job. Yeah, the status quo is very powerful. The status quo holds.
The best way to make the current funding formula popular is to try to change it. Exactly. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon, and he's Kevin Mullin. I used to say that when he was sitting over here, but he's moved over there and moved on to bigger and better things. State Assemblyman Kevin Mullin. Thanks for being with us. We were talking about the budget. That isn't quite the pressing issue it was, but there now is a push for a whole series of reforms in different areas. Reform of the initiative process, of CEQA, of pension. Let's sort of take them one at a time, starting with the CEQA, which obviously environmentalists are leery of anybody who's changing anything, but the flip side of that is there are people who say you can't get anything done, that CEQA is so difficult to deal with that it costs money, it delays projects, and often gives people a chance to disrupt getting anything done.
Right, so California Environmental Quality Act, there has been a call for reform and limiting some of the abuses, lawsuit abuse. But that's, if you talk to some folks who are opposed to reform, they will say actually the abuses are minimal. And lawsuits are fairly minimal, and there's really nothing wrong with the law. So the politics of this break down generally. You've got the governor who is pushing CEQA reform. You have the business community, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, and others pointing to this as something that inhibits economic development and growth in the state. You have, on the other side...
Let me interrupt you there,
Sure.
because one of the things you talk about as your priorities on your website and through the campaign is economic development and job growth. Is it your sense that there are things about CEQA that are inhibiting job growth, and that there's an appropriate way to look at this as, is there a way to make it better without undermining the environmental safeguards?
Oh, well, that's the key, that last phrase you used, which is, I think there's probably some kind of a middle course here where you can have some modest changes that don't undermine, the basic core functions of CEQA, which many consider very successful environmental protection for decades now. So I guess everything is viewed in a political context in Sacramento because it's just sort of in the abstract unless something can actually move through the process. The action has been on the Senate side with then State Senator Michael Rubio leading the charge, who just very recently resigned to take a job with Chevron. Mm-hmm. Citing family concerns. He has a special needs daughter, and he made his personal choice there. But I think that does hurt the reform effort that was moving in the Senate side. The politics of this, you've got environmentalists, you've got building trades unions who have formed something of a opposing coalition, and those folks hold a lot of sway. Union folks hold a lot of sway. But you have the governor and the legislative leaders talking about some kind of reform. The question is, what will it be? I wouldn't be surprised to see a bill come over to the Assembly side that's more modest in scope than Senator Rubio had been proposing. Something modest that could get broad-based support, where it's certainly not as far as the business community would like, and maybe it certainly doesn't make environmentalists and building trades folks happy, but it's something that people can live with, and maybe sort of a modest step down that road. So but again, it remains to be seen what happens on the Senate side. The Assembly is not taking action of any consequence on that issue right now. It's really on the Senate side, and we'll see sort of what we wind up with. But just on your issue of business activity, economic development, I think that's a very real issue. If CEQA reform doesn't happen, the governor doesn't really have, frankly, a policy to point to that's making California more competitive. And I'm not really talking so much about the Rick Perry versus Governor Brown sort of PR spat, if you will, between two governors of big states. But in terms of regulatory issues, in terms of tax issues, I'm interested, for example, the centerpiece of my legislative package is manufacturing equipment and research and development equipment sales tax exemption, which most states have. California does not. California had it up until 2004 when it sunsetted because of economic concerns and so forth. Manufacturing jobs are, we're hemorrhaging those kinds of jobs in California. Those jobs, manufacturing jobs, are growing in the overwhelming majority of other states right now, with the exception of California. So we need to rebuild our middle class, blue-collar job base, but also as the economy transitions from the traditional industrial manufacturing blue-collar to more of a research and development, biotech, high-tech kind of economy, this is a way to bridge that because we deal with both industries in this bill. But there's a cost to the bill. We have to find a way to pay for it. We haven't received any signals yet from the governor if he's willing to embrace it, but I know that we're putting a coalition, bipartisan, and a geographically diverse support base for this kind of a bill. And I'm hoping the governor says, well, if CEQA reform can't happen in a major way, maybe this is a way to signal to business that we are serious about making California as business friendly as we can be. Yeah. And I think that would be a good thing as the economy gradually recovers here.
The initiative process is historically in California has been sort of this untouchable. It is one of the fundamental citizen rights that has been safeguarded for a long time, and yet a lot of people think it's been overwhelmed by special interests, that it's a way of bypassing the legislature, it's a way of trying to address really complicated issues in overly simplistic ways. It may be a tribute to the law of unintended consequences. There's talk about initiative reform. What do you think might happen there?
Well, a pretty powerful individual, Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, has taken up this issue. It's a centerpiece of his efforts in Sacramento. So whenever a legislative leader is taking up something, it gets attention. It will be difficult to get something major through, I think, but there's an appreciation, I think, now of the problems with the initiative process, that there should be some kind of legislative review either on the front end or some kind of sunsetting provisions. The hard part is if you sort of lower the bar on getting an initiative on the ballot in terms of signatures to be collected, you may spawn too many initiatives.
Let me cut you off there. We'll come back to this subject in a second. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. We have here Assemblyman Kevin Mullin, Democrat from South San Francisco and many other places, representing San Mateo County in the state legislature and the assembly. We were talking about initiative reform, talking about if you make it easier, then sometimes you make the problem worse. The payoff is the legislature reviews the legislation and has the opportunity to put it in place. Of course, one of the reasons the initiatives have become so popular is because the legislature was seen as a place that wasn't getting anything done.
Well, that's exactly it, and that was the point that I was building to before the break, was that the hope is, and this is a big hope, but the optimism being felt in Sacramento is that if you can reestablish the legislature as a functioning body, a functioning representative democracy, where reform doesn't go to die, but where reform ideas can actually find some life, that there will be more of an inclination to work through the legislative process as opposed to going around the legislature. Now, that's a theory, it's easy to say, but when you see the needle moving on public opinion of the legislature, when you have almost half of the legislature turnover, you have 39 new members, you've got a term limit reform that has now taken effect, so the new members who come to the Assembly, really, I think most of these folks don't really have much of an interest in moving on to the state Senate. They want to stay in the Assembly, develop some policy expertise on issues that they care about. And you actually have the conditions where you can build relationships across party aisle probably more important now than ever since the Democrats have a supermajority. It's not the other way. The fact that we have a supermajority, I think we really need to redouble our efforts actually to reach out so Republicans are not so isolated in the policymaking process and are more constructive in the conversation in Sacramento. But the goal is that with this culture change that you may see in Sacramento, that folks won't be so inclined to go to the initiative, that they work through the legislature. The overarching goal here is to reestablish the legislature's standing with the public. And that's, to me, that's very meaningful work. And it's not captured in a bill. It's not captured in 5 bills. It's really a institutional effort, cross-party, bicameral, to reestablish longer-term policymaking, that function. So it's not just so short-term and campaign-driven and special interest-driven. It's about policy. And that's a way to
restore some balance between policy and politics,
which
hasn't existed for a long time. So in that context, is that perhaps the most meaningful state government reform we've had in a while? Are there other reforms in particular? I mean, everybody's upset about pensions, public employee pensions. I know there was some pension reform that's being challenged now as violating the bargaining rights of organized represented units. But is that something that still has more work to do? Because you're seeing at a state level, but also at a local government level, with which you're well familiar, all those pension obligations are going to have to start showing up on the books of public agencies now as genuine present-day debt. Right. It's going to make a lot of local budgets look a lot worse than maybe they actually are. But in any case, there's that growing public sentiment that these public pensions are threatening to bankrupt public agencies.
Right. I think the pension reform that occurred prior to my election was a good first step. I think the legislature should be applauded for engaging that issue. I think there are still long-term liabilities that are daunting, and especially when you look at retiree medical, retiree health care, major costs. The STIR system, the State Teachers Retirement System, it has some very alarming numbers coming forth about that system being underfunded. These are real concerns that need to be addressed legislatively, but I don't think you're going to see a major effort. You're not going to see pension reform 2, if you will. You won't see the sequel this year or maybe even next year. I think there's a sense that you want to see how this reform works. But certainly, if my class, if I'm fortunate enough to be there for 8 years, 10 years, who knows, I think we will absolutely have to engage this issue again once we have updated numbers. Certainly, the teachers' retirement system that issue is begging for a fix. But there's also, you mentioned the local government. Most of these colleagues of mine hail from local government. We've just come through this. We've seen our balance sheets on the local level. There's concern. There's a thought of forming some kind of a municipal governance caucus of some type of former local officials. One of my colleagues, Susan Eggman, from Stockton, had to vote for bankruptcy in that community. These are folks that have lived through some of these debates, so it's still fresh. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll see our class in particular want to do something, because that gets to the heart of the longer-term policy-making function and stabilizing the fiscal situation, both for the state government and municipalities.
Well, we've only got a couple minutes left, so let's tackle Prop 13.
Oh, okay. How much time again?
That's the other, obviously there, especially among liberal Democrats, frustration. As a former local government official, you know how much authority has been taken away from local government with the passage of Prop 13. There's the whole issue of the balance between the cost, the percentage of residential property that's paying into property taxes versus corporate or business property. Is there any sort of reform, even if it's a minor tweak? Is there a crack in the door of doing something to Prop 13?
I definitely think reform is in the air. You won't see anything on the residential side. The corporate loophole, Tom Amiano, my colleague from San Francisco, Assemblyman Amiano, has legislation to deal with that. The corporate loophole in terms of property transfer from one corporate entity to the next. That will get attention. I think the overall thrust, you're correct in, with 13, essentially moving power up to Sacramento, away from localities. The governor talks about subsidiarity, which is, essentially...
Which may even be a word.
Yeah, I had to look it up. But his discussion around local control has been in the schools context. This is the governor who took redevelopment away from local communities, which hit my community, South San Francisco, very hard. Others that rely on redevelopment to do economic development, to build affordable housing, to build infrastructure. It was part of the reason we were able to attract biotech companies to South San Francisco, as we built out an infrastructure and reutilizing some lands. It was critical to our downtown revitalization plan. So he took that away. Yeah. So there will be an effort, I think, to move power back to local governments, give local governments economic development tools. So it's not a direct connection to Prop 13, but I think there's going to be an overall move to invest more power, fiscal autonomy, fiscal authority at the local level, where people where the governing units are closer to the people than sending your money to Sacramento.
And that's a good place to stop.
All right.
Kevin, thanks for being with us. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you, Mark.
And thank you for joining us. Be with us next time on The Game.